Okay, so frustratingly, I got cut off the last video. Cut off because it wasn't finished. Sometimes that happens, and I sort of just let it be because I've more or less said what I need to say. But this particular one, there was a few other points I wanted to make. It was a video about miscarriages of justice. It is frustrating because I always think then people won't necessarily look at the second part, but that's what it is. I think I've got space issues. So anyway. Um, I want to talk about miscarriages of justice in the UK. Now, in the last video, I briefly touched on really some high profile cases like Oscar Slater, um, Derek Bentley, Stephen Downing, Stefan Kitchko, the Birmingham Six, Judith Ward. These are all people who were implicated for crimes that they didn't commit or there was significant doubt over their conviction. So I'm just going to read out a few more names just to continue this list. And like I said in the last one, I'm not going to cover every single case. That would be impossible for one video. Unfortunately, this country's had more than its share. So 1978, the Bridgewater Four. This was involving the murder of a boy, and these four men were convicted in 1979 of murdering Carl Bridgewater, 13-year-old paper boy who was shot on his round when he disturbed robbers at a farm in Staffordshire. Patrick Molloy died in jail in 1981. The remaining three were released in 1997 after their convictions were overturned, and they served some 18 years for that crime. It took place in Starbridge in the West Midlands. And actually, West Midlands Police was later implicated in large-scale corruption around that period of the late 70s to 1980s, which put jeopardy into a lot of cases that they'd been involved in. It was one of the most egregious examples of corruption in any British police force. And bear in mind, West Midlands Police is one of the biggest, after, of course, the Metropolitan Police in London and Greater Manchester Police. Okay, some other cases. Michael Shirley. Uh, this was a young man in the Royal Navy. And he was convicted of the rape and murder of a 24-year-old barmaid in Portsmouth in 1986. After completing the recommended minimum 15 years of his life sentence, he maintained his innocence even though this meant he would not be released on parole. In 2002, the case was referred by the Criminal Cases Review Commission to the Court of Appeal, where the conviction was quashed on the basis of fresh DNA evidence. So this young man, Michael Shirley, served some 16 years for a crime that he didn't commit. And that's an important case actually to look at because he had an opportunity for parole to be released after 15 years, but he chose not to because of the principle that I'm not going to admit to a crime that I didn't commit. And this is something on both sides of the Atlantic called innocent prisoner's dilemma. That is, they can only get a parole if they admit to the crime. But if you're innocent, you're not going to admit to something that you didn't do. And if you do admit to it, you'll get the early release, but then you're a murderer. So it's something that definitely needs to be, I think, remedied. I think there needs to be pathways, let's say, for people who do strongly maintain their innocence over time. I'm not saying guilty people aren't capable of saying they're innocent, but just because someone says they're innocent doesn't mean they are. I do think that the system should be such that it's concrete. And I think one thing with all these cases is lessons need to be learned. Um, the Cardiff newsagent free, this is a case from 1987. Some of these I'm not so familiar with. So in this case, the trio were wrongly convicted for the murder of a newsagent, Philip Saunders, who was battered with a spade outside his Cardiff home. The day's takings from his kiosk had been stolen, and 5 days later he died of his injuries. The Court of Appeal quashed their convictions in 1999. The three have since been paid six-figure compensation. South Wales Police has still not apologised or admitted liability for malicious prosecution, which is a disgrace. Um, so for police officers not to do that is pretty disgraceful. Um, and then on this, there's another Cardiff Free case, and I'm wondering, this would appear to be a separate case. Um, yeah, that's a bit confusing. There's actually two cases in Cardiff, one in 1987 and one in 1988. One called the Cardiff Newsagent Free, and the other the Cardiff Free. So not to be confused, the Cardiff Free the following year were falsely jailed in 1990 for the murder of Lynette White, who was a sex worker in Cardiff, later cleared on appeal due to DNA evidence. In 2003, Jeffrey Gaffer was jailed for life for the murder. Subsequently, in 2005, 12 police officers were arrested and questioned for false imprisonment, conspiracy to pervert the course of justice, and misconduct. In 2011, 8 of the officers stood trial at Taunton Crown Court for perverting the course of justice. I'm pleased to hear that, together with three witnesses accused of perjury. However, the case collapsed as the judge ruled that officers could not be given a fair trial due to the previous publicity. Then there was a case called the M25 Free. In 1988, convictions ruled unsafe after an appeal to the European Court of Justice, which is something actually that came up with the Remain side during the Brexit debate, that would go out the window. Sally Clark, convicted for the murder of her two sons in Devizes, Wiltshire. She served 4 years. Um, so she was convicted of the murder of her two young sons, Christopher and Harry. And this relates to the controversial Professor Sir Roy Meadow, whose testimony implicated several other women and became pretty notorious. And it sort of became in a sense, a cause celebre of professional being believed over ordinary people. And many believe that he should have faced a tougher penalty for his false testimony in those cases. Um, I mean, sadly, Sally Clark became an alcoholic and died of alcohol poisoning as a result of her ordeal. Sean Jenkins is a better known recent case, um, or well known recent case. He was acquitted in February 2006 after a second retrial of the 1997 murder of his foster daughter, Billy Joe Jenkins. This is a case I think was featured on Crime Watch a few times. He was convicted in 1998, but the conviction was quashed in 2004 following a CCRC referral. Not sure what that means. The basis of the quashed conviction at the Court of Appeal were the concessions by the Crown's pathologists that evidence given at the first tribunal were inaccurate, and that occurred in Hastings, East Sussex, and Sean Jenkins served 6 years for that. Barry White um, and Barry George, two cases. I'll touch on the Barry George case. 1999, the murder of Jill Danbo, the popular Crime Watch presenter. Um, for international viewers, Crime Watch was a program in the UK that covered crimes, and sad irony is its own presenter was murdered in 1999. Anyway, the man convicted of that, Barry George, served 7 years of a life sentence, and he was cleared in August 2008 after a retrial in which police were unable to rely on discredited forensic evidence. Um, and I'll just cover a few others. Now, this one might raise a few eyebrows. Jed Evans, 2011. Evans, of course, was a professional footballer, and he was convicted of a rape of a 15-year-old girl, who, of course, was anonymous. Now, in 2015, the Criminal Cases Review Commission referred the case to the Court of Appeal, having examined new evidence from two of the complainant's previous sexual partners about her behaviour, which bore similarities to Evans' account that the Commission decided could not reasonably be explained as a coincidence. In 2016, the Court of Appeal quashed the conviction and ordered a retrial in which Evans was found not guilty, and he served 2 years and 6 months for the crime of rape. I say that's controversial because some people still believe he should have served time regardless of that situation. I have mixed views on it. I think if you sleep with a 15-year-old girl, you're asking for trouble. Now, as I understand, he maintained that he didn't know her age. I don't know, who knows if that's true or not. But I know that he's had difficulty finding a club ever since. So, has he been treated unfairly? Has he not? I don't really know, to be honest. Um, but what you do see with most of these cases is kind of a trial by media, particularly in high profile cases. And I do think that's profoundly dangerous because, particularly with heinous crimes, like if there's been a particularly brutal murder or a child murder or a rape of a child or something like that, you know, public emotions can sometimes cloud fair judgment. And that's a very, very dangerous thing. Um, and then the most recent case featured here is the Oval Four. These were four men who were arrested by undercover police led by DS Derek Ridgewell at the Oval Tube Station in March 1972. Um, they later claimed to have been beaten up in custody but were tried and found guilty. Subsequently, a number of Ridgewell's cases were discovered to be unsound and overturned, while Ridgewell himself eventually died in prison, having been convicted stealing mailbags. In 2019, the four men's case was returned to the appeal court, who overturned the convictions after 47 years. And they'd served 8 months for robbery and resisting arrest. That must be one of the longest, that's almost half a century, the longest cases of a case being overturned. So, like I say, I haven't covered every case there. There are many others. At the start of the video yesterday, I said that crime is a terrible thing, but so is a miscarriage of justice. I think that must be one of the most terrifying things to be in jail for a crime you didn't commit. Not only the difficulty of serving a jail sentence, but then the stigma of it, potentially being attacked by other inmates, particularly if it's a particularly sensitive crime like child murder or rape, um, being publicly vilified even if your name's cleared. That is why it's so awful. And I think that lessons need to be learned from all these cases. It sounds like a cliche, but it's so very important. And I would also say where police, there is strong indication that police have been involved in cover-ups or corruption or coerced confessions. They should. It's not good enough to apologize. There needs to be arrests. Police officers cannot be above the law. And I think sometimes, particularly with high-profile crimes, there is enormous pressure on the police to get a suspect. I mean, we know from the recent death of Peter Sutcliffe that at the height of the Yorkshire Ripper killings, there was enormous pressure on West Yorkshire police. Women were understandably scared, and there was very real tensions in the community. Um, and I mean, Sutcliffe, was an evil man, and it's good that he served a lengthy sentence for what he'd done. But at the time, it would have been very possible that an innocent man could have been implicated. So um, I think miscarriages of justice are terrible, and you can find them in every country on earth, including countries with supposedly good human rights record. You know, there's Nordic states in there. Iceland has a particularly notorious case. So this doesn't just happen in countries that have dubious human rights records like Iran or China. Unfortunately, it happens all over the world. Of course, the difference is in China, there's no free media to scrutinize it. Um, and in countries with the death penalty, there's no going back. A quick point about the British justice system. In the United States, in most states that carry the death penalty, I understand it's a governor who has the final say. So we always hear about, make a call to the governor. In Britain, until we abolished the death penalty, that decision lay with the Home Secretary. Um, and that was very much the case in some of these notorious cases like Derek Bentley, where I think in that case it was um, Lord Maxwell Fyfe, who was a long-serving Home Secretary, and it was a controversial aspect of his parliamentary career that he didn't clear Derek Bentley at the time, or didn't reprieve Derek Bentley at the time, and there were other such cases. So my closing thoughts with this is that there has to be lessons learned. It sounds like a cliche, but miscarriage of justice is a terrible, terrible thing. And I think that victims of miscarriage of justice should be viewed just as sympathetically to victims of crime. And I'm conservative on crime. I believe in tough justice, but it has to be concrete. It cannot be by coercion. It cannot be by coercion. I'm obviously talking about forced confessions, that sort of thing. And there can't be a immediate trial either. It's a very dangerous thing. Um, and it's also a lesson to the public. that we cannot always jump to conclusions, particularly with emotive crimes. It's understandable that people get angry, but innocent people have been implicated for things they haven't done. And sometimes you also get situations where not necessarily people are in prison, but they're sometimes falsely targeted. I remember when Sarah Payne was murdered, the little schoolgirl, 2000, a lot of people who were perceived to be paedophiles were targeted even though they weren't. And that wasn't helped by tabloids stoking up tensions. Um, the same with the Soham case. There were women who looked like Maxine Carr, a woman involved in that. They simply looked like her. So those women were falsely targeted. There's a lot of ugly things happened. Mob mentality is a very, very ugly thing. And I think the media, and I'm thinking particularly of the tabloids, have a very big responsibility here. And they don't always show it. So let me know your thoughts. Just a quick word on something else that's got nothing to do with this video. Two prominent deaths in the last few days. Diego Maradona, of course, needs no introduction. Some call him the greatest footballer ever. I don't follow football, but that's big news. And David Dinkins, the first black mayor of New York City, who had a mixed record, but in my view tried his best. They have both passed away in recent days. Thanks for watching, and let me know your thoughts on miscarriages of justice. By the way, there's a project